level. So back in I think it was early to mid-March, we had our first North-South Ministerial Council meeting, which included the Taoiseach, the Tánaiste, our First Minister, Deputy First Minister, respective health ministers and officials. And since that time, we've had a series of teleconferences, which have included respective ministers from both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland office, again discussing quite a wide range of issues. I've been and have been able to attend and participate in those conversations. And we've also, between the Republic of Ireland and ourselves in Northern Ireland, we've drawn up a memorandum of understanding, which really just builds on the very long established working arrangements that we have in place. And so that covers issues such as modelling, issues such as behavioural science, issues in relation to research, ethics. And again, we take the learning and the information that colleagues in England, Scotland and Wales have developed, and the Republic of Ireland share information with ourselves. So we can have a truly integrated and fully informed picture. So the interaction that colleagues have described within the UK is a very productive one, and similarly the interface between myself and Dr. Houlihan and his officials and colleagues in the Republic and across these islands more generally is working extremely well, including at a ministerial level.
Thank you.
Can I ask Dr. McBride, just on the memorandum which was enacted a few weeks ago, it's more guidance as opposed to a kind of unified approach, as I understand it, across Republic and Northern Ireland. But are there instances, like for example in recent press coverage, whereby in the Republic the government has talked about the 2 kilometres distancing in terms of going out to exercise? Are there areas whereby, politics aside, that you think from the epidemiological point of view that policy should be more consistent across the border?
I think that, I mean, obviously we as officials advise and ministers decide, and I think that's, you know, the member from Glasgow Northwest in response to her earlier question, as officials, as chief medical officers, as chief scientific advisors, we provide advice to ministers, and ministers make decisions in their own jurisdiction. As Gregor has said, the epidemic within individual countries and parts of the UK has behaved a little differently, and there are many factors which may feed into that, including issues such as population density. So obviously it's important that each jurisdiction, ministers within each jurisdiction will make decision in terms of which are most appropriate to ensure that the appropriate measures are applied at the appropriate points in time. And equally, any conversation in the future about how those measures we may step back from those. But we also need to bear in mind that clearly, whilst there may be some public health and scientific basis from some regional variation on that, the public messaging on that is crucially important as well. I mean, we share a land border with the Republic of Ireland, and as you will know yourself, many villages that span the border. A third of the villages in the Republic of Ireland and 2/3 is in Northern Ireland. So again, those issues as they are in the interface between Wales, England, and the interface between parts of England and Scotland, those are really important issues which, as I say, we will be approaching in a joined up way. And I think the relationship we have as chief medical officers, long established, and respected public health bodies in providing advice to ministers, I think will be helpful in that respect.
Thank you, Dr. McBride. If we could keep answers as short as possible, then we'll get through lots of questions. I'm going to turn to Stephen Crabb, then Andrew Griffith, then Pete Wishart. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to direct a question to Dr. Atherton. And first of all, start off by saying thank you to you, Dr. Atherton, for everything you're doing at this time for the people of Wales. But I'd like to ask you about the importance of testing and tracing in the Welsh context and how that fits in with the wider UK approach to tackling coronavirus. Because I have to say, it isn't clear to me that there's a very clear plan for testing that's being unrolled in Wales. Today, Welsh Government, unlike Scottish Government, has chosen not to be part of the UK Government testing portal that went live. The Welsh Minister has dropped the testing targets in Wales. I hear that some of the health boards in Wales haven't been fully cited on the Deloitte rollout of the regional testing centres. So I wonder whether, Dr. Atherton, you could just give us a bit of an insight into how the policy on testing is being developed in Wales and who actually is calling the shots. Is there a UK-wide framework at work here? Is it Welsh Government? Is it Deloitte? Where is policy being made and how is it being executed?
Dr. Atherton.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will try to be brief. One of the structures that we created in Wales was a technical advisory cell, which was the equivalent of what Gregor was describing in Scotland. It was our attempt to take the scientific information from SAGE and translate it into the Welsh context. And one of the uses of that advisory cell was to look in detail at testing. And quite early on, it developed for the Welsh Government a testing policy, which we've been using consistently since then. And that talked about the ramping up of our numbers, the increasing capacity that we've been driving forwards in Wales, and which has been subject to a lot of discussion, of course. But it also, more importantly, talked about the use of the testing, how we were going to use it. And it was very clear from early days that we had four main areas that we wanted to use for testing. We wanted to, first of all, make sure it was used for patient care, direct patient care, for testing patients who were presenting through the health system. But secondly, to look after the interests of health and care workers. So very early on, we recognised that we needed to look after their health, and so we turned some of our testing capacity to that use. The third area was always around surveillance, about getting a better understanding of how the virus was transmitting in the population and in subgroups of the population, particularly hospitals and care homes. And the fourth priority was to look after care other key workers, police, fire, everybody who were being unable to work because either they were unwell or the family members were unwell. That's been our approach throughout. We were very fortunate in Wales that very early on in the epidemic, we were able to develop testing capacity within the University Hospitals of Wales, because we have some very gifted and talented virologists who work there. So we got that up and running really very quickly, and that's really how we've been using our testing ever since.
Stephen Crowd, do you want to come back on that?
I just wonder whether, just very briefly, Dr. Atherton, were you consulted on the decision for Welsh Government not to be part of the new portal that was launched today for testing? Was that a decision that was run past you?
So I think we should distinguish between the sharing of science and understanding and the sharing of policy. And some of the areas like that portal were really not discussed in detail across the four nations. And so one of the issues that we've had is trying to understand how practice is working across the different nations. So although broad strategy has been very clearly agreed, and we've been discussing that, as we say, through the four CMOs group and through the senior clinicians group, there have been occasions where we would have liked in Wales to have a little earlier notification of some of the practical details, and I would sense that would be one of them. Now, having said that, we do have our own approach to testing of key workers, of course, to surveillance, some of the other issues that we're involved with. And so there are some things that we need to do distinctly in Wales, and there are other things that we need to do in a joined up way across the four nations, and sometimes because our border, of course, is with England, on England and Wales basis.
Okay. On the point of being part of the portal or not, so you were drawing a distinction, I think, between the operational aspects and the scientific aspects. Would that be right? Do you confine your advice to the science, or would you regard the administration of the testing regime as something separate from that?
So understanding both is really important to us and to our teams as we move forwards. I would say that the CMOs group tends to look at more broad strategic issues, but the clinicians group that meets and includes NHS England tends to look at more in more operational detail. Along with colleagues from Northern Ireland and Scotland, we became involved with that second group, perhaps a little later in the epidemic, but have found it absolutely invaluable in understanding some of the operational details. So in fact, we often in Wales get information from that source, which then gives us lines to follow up in across the border in England.
Thank you. Are you a member of SAGE?
I'm not personally a member. We have a representative in SAGE who is an observer. Our Chief Science Officer for Health, Dr. Rob Orford, has been an observer in SAGE from a very early day, and that's really helpful because he can he goes there. He chairs our technical advisory cell, which then translates SAGE advice into advice to me and to Welsh ministers.
And doesn't that provide a means for you to have visibility of what is being done at the UK level, simultaneously with England, as well as Scotland and Northern Ireland?
Well, that is a way to get information from the UK across the four nations, and it's a very valuable route of information to us. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll go to Andrew Griffith and Pete Wishcott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the CMOs for joining us. I'd like to take an opportunity of this unrivaled lineup of you each to explore a little bit about your experience of the process, and in particular, scope limitations of your advice. So do you think, in your experience when you're advising ministers or administrations, you are always sufficiently clear about the limitations of the data sets that you're working with? Do you, for example, cite a statistical confidence interval when you give predictions or scenarios? And do you feel that that's always fully understood by the ministers and other advisors? And then I've got one more, Mr. Chairman, if you come back to me afterwards. And I thought just Mr. Professor Whitty and Dr. Smith initially, perhaps.
Thank you. Professor Whitty.
Well, I think that providing the uncertainty around something, as you put it, the limits of the data, is a key part of trying to explain any kind of scientific information in any operational sense. So one of the things you're trying to convey is both the central projection, this is where, on average, we think things are going to go, and also the uncertainty around that. And if there are formal confidence intervals, you can't have them in all settings. You also ideally provide those confidence intervals. Now, the reason I'm differentiating between confidence intervals and uncertainty is quite a lot of the key information and key science is actually social science, qualitative science, and for that, a formal confidence intervals wouldn't actually be the right thing to do. But certainly, you need to be able to convey level of certainty as part of any kind of scientific communication.
Okay, Andrew. And it was, I think, Dr. Smith, wasn't it? You were...
Yeah, just in the interest of moving the panel around a bit, perhaps if Dr. Smith could give us his experience, and then I've got one more.
Dr. Smith.
So I agree wholeheartedly with Professor Whitty's view there about the use of uncertainty and confidence intervals and the importance of not confusing the two. I think we have to acknowledge that particularly in the early days, the science and the knowledge in terms of this virus was growing very, very rapidly, and much of the data that we were using at that stage did have great uncertainty round about it, and so that was always a very strong feature of the conversations that I certainly had with my politicians to make sure that they understood. I'm very fortunate to work with politicians who are very comfortable with using data, and the explanations that were given at those stages were very much taken on board.
Thank you. Andrew Griffith?
Yeah, Chair, my second question was, when we think about management, research into high-performing teams reveal they typically have a very high range of cognitive diversity amongst their membership, and they actually seek out deliberately dissenting views. And I wondered if each of you could give us an example of where that has been the case during the process of you giving advice on COVID-19.
Who should we start with? Perhaps Dr. McBride?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incumbent. Sorry, my audio link broke down a little bit there, but I think just in terms of the main thrust of the question, I think it's incumbent upon all of us that we express to ministers on matters of this import, the limitations of the advice that we are providing. I'm not sure if that was the full question, Chair.
Well, let's come to Professor Whitty on that. It was about dissent and disagreement and having diversity of views being something that contributes.
Well, I think that in a sense there's two different sorts of diversity to think about. One of which is multiple forms. There's diversity of experience, there's diversity of discipline, very important in this kind of area where you're having to essentially integrate multiple sciences with very different intellectual traditions. I can absolutely guarantee that my academic colleagues, and of course you've got to remember there's the SAGE structure, but underneath that sit multiple other scientific professional scientific advisory groups, and underneath that the whole body of fantastic academic work. And there's a huge amount of dissent and very, very large amounts of debate. And in a sense, the whole point of the system is to try and bring together dissenting views and also bring together views from very many disciplines and bring them to a central agreement. And then, as you pointed out in your first question, then say to people, but there is a range of opinion where that's true. And actually it is important to capture that range of opinion, whether it's in a committee room or if it's brought in from outside.
Have you always been able to give unified advice in the committee?
I have, well, in this particular epidemic, we've certainly been able to say this is a central projection. We've also had to say there's quite a wide range around that. And in particular, as Dr. Smith said right at the beginning of his answer, this is an area where we were starting off with a completely new disease, very large degree of uncertainty at the beginning. Even on some of the basic quantitative numbers, we had very wise confidence intervals around things like mortality rates, really at the beginning. Those begin to narrow down, but there are still quite significant areas of science where we have considerable uncertainty, and some areas of science where we have to say we simply don't know. And we might want to come back to that later in the session, because some of the areas, some of the critical bits of information, we still do not know the answer.
We'll do that. There's obviously uncertainty about something that is happening very quickly in real time. But in terms of the advice, it is an advisory group to government. Are there any material instances in which the committee has felt it necessary to offer differing advice? In other words, to kind of present different opinions within the advisory group, or has everyone come to a consensus on what the advice should be, notwithstanding uncertainty of the modelling?
So it's not very useful to ministers or other decision makers to say, well, there were 16 opinions and here are all the 16, make your mind up. So part of the process is to say in a unified way, here's the central view. And then if there are either dissenting views or if there is a range of uncertainty quantitatively around that, also to convey that in a way that's comprehensible to the people who are listening, so they understand the certainty with which that advice is being proffered. Because if they don't do that, it's clearly going to lead to bad decision making.
Thank you. And in terms of that central view, just finally on this, has in every material instance, has that included your colleagues in all 4 nations of the United Kingdom?
There are sort of 2 ways in which that happens. The science from which the central view is derived comes absolutely from all 4 nations, and if not through any deliberate engineering, but if you look at, for example, chairs of different groups, if you look at people who have particular expertise, they will come from around the UK, unsurprisingly. And then, as Dr. Atherton was saying, representatives of all 4 nations are in the SAGE discussions. Whether people are called an observer or not slightly depends on simply their technical expertise, but they all contribute to this. And if there are views which would lead to a significant divergence, because the epidemiology is different, for example, that needs to be captured as part of the decision making.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Smith, perhaps going back to Andrew's question about diversity, you've heard Professor Whitty's answer and Dr. McBride's.
For us, it's been a very important feature of the development of our CMO advisory group is to get that range of diverse scientific opinion. And that's why when we set up the group, it was really important for us to make sure that it had a very largely independent status from the kind of mechanisms of the Scottish Government, taking in a range of people who we knew were quite willing to express quite a diverse range of opinions. Anyone who's been around with the scientific community for any length of time knows that there's very often a wide range of opinions which are expressed, but it's the synthesis of those arguments that actually brings the value in the advice that we are then able to provide to ministers so that they can then apply their judgment to the decisions that we make.
Thank you. Let me go to Pete Wishart.
Thank you personally for the very kind invitation to attend your proceedings today. You will know that the government are not obliged to establish my committee at this time, so this is the closest that we'll come to scrutiny in Scotland just now. But can I ask the CMOs, and it's mainly for the CMOs from the devolved nations, whether they feel that the four-nation strategy and approach that's been adopted has allowed them the operational independence to respond to particular issues and trends within their own nation. And as we start to think about coming out of lockdown just now, surely it would be practical for each of the four nations to determine its own approach to that, given that each nation is in a different place on the curve and there is a disparity of severity across all the nations of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Perhaps starting with Dr. Smith.
So one of the things which has been very important all the way is to share the science so that we can then develop the advice for our own respective ministers to be able to develop the policy that underpins that. And the science, as I've said before, tends to be the science no matter which part of the United Kingdom you're in. There will be different stages of the epidemic in the UK that each of the countries find themselves in, but there is a value in also making sure that the messaging to the public, so that the measures which have been applied are applied with consistency, and that we see the right level of compliance from the public. And I think one of the things, once you start to kind of develop a mixed message to the public, there's always the risk that people will misunderstand the message and won't know in one part of the country what they're supposed to be doing compared to other ones. So the messaging becomes very important. That's not to say that when there's the need to apply a different type of measure because of the different stages, that we shouldn't undertake that, but we should just be very confident that it's the right thing for that part of the country to do at that point in time. In Scotland, we've had the benefit, as I say, of this advisory group to give us additional advice to that which we've received from the UK advisory structures, and that's led to a slightly nuanced or different approach on occasion when that's been the right thing for Scotland. And if that applies on the way into applying the measures, then I think equally that applies on the way out of the measurements. However, I would emphasise again, there would need to be, I think, very good reason to make sure that that was absolutely necessary, because the needs of Scotland in those instances was very different from the rest of the UK.
So there would need to be particular differences in the circumstances in Scotland.
So the differences in the circumstances might be that the stage of the epidemic was just so wildly different in Scotland from the rest of the country that actually there was a need to make sure that we took a different approach. Or the alternative is that the approach that was taken in other parts of the UK was so different that it wouldn't be right for Scotland to do that at the right time. And as I say, then we apply the scientific evidence to the Scottish context through the structures that we've developed here to make sure that we can give the right advice to our ministers so that they can use their judgment in how we approach it.
I see. Perhaps I can put Pete's question to Dr. Atherton.
Yeah, I mean, I come back to my point about broad agreement on overall strategy and then operational independence. So absolutely, in Wales, we do feel that we have the freedom to do that. After all, we run our own devolved health and social care system, and it is an integrated system. So I can mention several examples of where the broad strategic agreement has translated into different approaches. We've already touched on one, the testing programme. Our approach to managing the shielding of the most vulnerable individuals in society had a Welsh twist to it. We had a slightly different process that we followed in Wales. Our arrangements for distributing personal protective equipment are slightly different in Wales as compared with the other countries. And indeed, you're right to stress the kind of exit from lockdown, because we are currently thinking about our approach to that, and our First Minister has been clear that we have 7 tests in Wales that we will apply as to how and when we can start to lift measures. They relate very, very much to the 5 measures which have been announced by Secretary of State in England. There's not a huge amount of difference in them in strategic terms, but there is some operational difference. So yes, we do have that flexibility, and that's really important to us in Wales, that we're able to tailor our response to the needs of the people in Wales.
Thank you. And Dr. McBride.
Obviously, as Frank said, I mean, health is devolved, and ministers will have ultimate discretion in terms of decisions that are made in respective jurisdictions. The science is the science, as Gregor has said, and there are important aspects around how the local health and social care systems look and operate in the different jurisdictions. But I think that as we move into stepping back from whatever measures and what order, I think that will be more in common than there will be different.
So I take it across all of you, I'll come back to you, Pete, that as you said, that there is no difference in the science between the nations, but there may be differences in the incident or the stage of development of the pandemic and operational differences in arrangements. So these account for the difference. So I take it from that. Thank you. Pete, come back with another question.
And thank you to all the CMOs for the very fulsome answer. What surprises me a little bit, I suppose, is given that we have all got our own health services, that there's been next to no operational difference across the United Kingdom, and there has been this unified approach. And I think this starts to matter now as we start to think about leaving lockdown. Now, I was impressed by the First Minister's programme yesterday, which just started to talk about this and the process that's involved. And I'm thinking about specifics like the schools in Scotland, for example. The holidays are different in Scotland, the rest of the United Kingdom. And I'm just wondering, and maybe Dr. Townsend could help me with this one, if there would be just that temptation just to fall into line, because it would just seem to be the right thing to do with what's happening in England and the rest of the United Kingdom, because it's a bigger partner. And if there's a sense that the nations of the United Kingdom are at a different stage of coming out of this, would it have to be all agreed by every CMO before certain steps were taken about coming out of lockdown?
Dr. Smith.
So again, I would just restate that being guided by the science becomes very important. Where there are differences in the approaches between the countries because of operational considerations, I've already stated that there may be some nuances between the different countries. Those will be taken into account. As I say, I think that's where it becomes really important that not only is it the scientific advice which is provided to the politicians and the ministers, but the way that then that is interpreted for the context of the country that the advice has been given becomes really critical. I go back to the point, that's why we have the CMO advisory group within Scotland, to be able to take that scientific evidence and apply it to the Scottish context and the unique considerations that we'll have in this country.
Thank you. Perhaps I can ask Professor Whitty, in his capacity as an advisor to the government, did SAGE give advice to the government on the target of the 100,000 tests a day?
Well, SAGE would not give. SAGE did not give that specific target. SAGE has consistently said, and indeed I have consistently said, that one of the things we needed to do was have a greater capacity to test across the whole of the UK, and that's, I'm glad to say, now happening. So the aim to increase it would absolutely be joined not just by SAGE, but to be clear, by all public health bodies and all ministers. And I don't think that there's really much difference there. So I think that the main questions on that one were operational. How fast could this increase happen? But the actual number was not a specific number recommended by SAGE specifically, but the general trend of it, absolutely. SAGE thinks there are quite a lot of things to be done with testing, and that therefore increasing it is very important for several reasons.
Does SAGE have a view as to what the volume of testing should be? There's obviously an interaction between what is desirable and what is operationally possible. How is that discussion reflected?
So SAGE has a view, is in fact developing a view at the moment about what the optimal maximum amount of antigen testing and indeed antibody testing. Those are different answers I can expand on that if you like, under a number of different scenarios. But there's a base case that everybody agrees that has to be done, which includes allowing critical workers to be tested, certainly includes greater testing within hospitals for people who don't currently have symptoms, for example, people who might be coming in for elective things, and greater testing in care homes. And what we're trying to do is get that basic number and then also build on top of that, what are the other things that we could use it for under a number of different ways of running the next stage of the epidemic, which is going to be a prolonged one, and therefore giving advice to all four nations, but the UK as a whole, about what they think broadly the numbers might end up looking like if we could get to an optimal number. But we have not yet got to the point where we've finally got a number on that.
I see. A lot of trust is clearly being placed in science. We hear this from the witnesses this morning. The government, all of the governments have made a clear commitment to being guided by the science, and science proceeds through openness and sometimes dispute, as we've heard already this morning. It's very important, it seems to me, that we should keep the faith in the science that is informing decisions by ministers. And there's been a publication of the evidence base that SAGE has drawn on to give advice. It's the scientific advice supporting the government's response to COVID-19. And the website that has this says that the page will be updated on a regular basis with the latest available evidence provided to SAGE. The latest evidence on the website was the 16th of March, it's about 5 weeks ago. Now, I wrote in advance of this meeting, as you know, to you, Professor Whitty, and to Sir Patrick Vallance, to ask whether that could be supplemented with the recent evidence so that we could understand it and ask questions about it. It's really reason why 5 weeks on from the last publication of evidence, the papers on which advice has been given should not be available for scrutiny.
So firstly, in this particular scenario, and I'll come back to a caveat to this, but in this particular crisis, there is no reason in principle why evidence should not be available. There are a number of things which are probably worth saying though. The first is a practical one, which as obviously a distinguished former cabinet minister yourself, you'll appreciate, which is advice should be given to ministers first, rather than a continual kind of churn of stuff. And that I think is probably not likely to change. But since SAGE advice translates into ministerial advice to ministers incredibly fast, that itself I don't think is really much of a barrier. There are, I have to say, also operational things. As a practical thing that the SAGE team are actually under huge pressure, and I think that also feeds in. And then there's the final thing, which quite a lot of the thing that comes to SAGE has come in a very, very early stage of development. And under ordinary academic circumstances, you would not put that out until it had been peer reviewed and brought into a final form, and in many cases got through the publication process. And that has also provided a delay in certain circumstances. And I have to say, as a scientist, I think that's right. You do not, as a scientist, wish to throw out the very, very, we need to get things in an incredibly timely way in SAGE. We do not, on the other hand, wish to put out into the public domain stuff that has not yet got to the point it's properly being completed and peer reviewed, ideally, in the usual way for proper critique. So the letter from Sir Patrick Vallance made clear that he is absolutely committed to publishing things on a regular cycle. And if we can exceed that cycle, fine, but I think, as always, try not to overpromise on these things. And absolutely, everything will be on the website after this is over, and ideally we'll update it all the way along. So fully accept the general principle you're making, but need to just be realistic about those reasons why you're not going to get every single paper published the next day for a combination of reasons. I do, though, want to add one additional caveat, and that is that SAGE, in this occasion, is dealing with something which is a straight science to policy question. The last time there was a SAGE thing, which at that point I was interim government chief scientific advisor I chaired, was the Novichok poisonings in Salisbury. there is absolutely no way we were going to put those documents on the public domain, and nor will we. Then I've also been involved previously in SAGE meetings where some of the information was at a classified level and some of it was not. And so again, there's going to be a mixture. So the point about this is wherever possible, we absolutely should be putting the data out, and wherever possible, in fact, we should be trying to give the underlying workings, and that's something Sir Patrick made clear in his correspondence to you. But with those practical things, just to be realistic about them. If you ask the average academic how long it takes them between their first draft of a paper and the one that actually gets published after peer review, a month is a very short time.
Everyone would understand the reservations, in fact, the impossibility of publishing matters that had impacts on national security. But would it not be a source of concern if a paper that were not ready for publication, were not fit to be put in the public domain, was nevertheless used as a basis for important decisions being made?
Well, this goes back absolutely to an important point you made earlier on, which is one of the things you do is with early drafts, you put a greater degree of uncertainty than you would around something where the same thing has gone through peer review and has rested in a sense its final form. And that's actually part of what you actually say is, look, this is people working through the night because this is a crisis, and they've done a really terrific job, but they're going to clean this up. They're going to go through peer review. Probably the published paper will end up looking slightly different to this one. And that's part of our job, is to give that degree of confidence or lack of confidence, not lack of confidence, but uncertainty around something. So you can say either we're really confident about this, or we're confident to a certain degree, and that is part of the process. So I think people, and I suspect people who are scientists listening to this or other academics will fully appreciate the point I'm making.
Thank you. Let me turn to Chris Clarkson.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, you've sort of picked up on the theme that I was going to ask about. I'd like to talk about transparency in the medical and scientific advice. Specifically, Dr. Smith, do you think it's important that Scotland's COVID-19 advisory group publishes the membership of the group and also its minutes?
So when this group was set up in Scotland by my predecessor, Dr. Calderwood, there was clearly the decision was taken to publish both the membership and minutes, and that's probably consistent with the approach that I've known that we've taken in government since I started working within the Scottish Government in 2012. So it doesn't seem unusual in that sense. It was right for the Scottish context, for the Scottish group at that point in time, and I don't think that we should read anything more into it than that.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Are you aware of any instances of lobbying or security issues from the public actually being aware of the membership of that group?
I've not been made aware of any instance such as that, no.
Thank you. My next question is to Professor Whitty, if I may. Are you content that the membership of SAGE still remains secret?
So the reason that membership of SAGE, so remember that SAGE is a body which meets under quite a lot of different circumstances. Sir Patrick, as chair of SAGE, and I'm co-chairing for the purposes of this, neither of us have any problem in principle with the names being made public. Many people talk about their own work on SAGE perfectly legitimately. I'm on SAGE, he's on SAGE, all of this is perfectly open. But we were given quite clear advice from the CPNI, the Central Protection of National Infrastructure, basically based on the fact that SAGE is a subcommittee of COBRA and meets under a range of circumstances, some of which are very security related. This is not. That the principle needed to be thought through quite carefully. Absolutely no barrier though from me or from Sir Patrick in principle. And the idea that it's secret, I think, is rather strong. I mean, I think it's not published. I suspect most members are actually known one way or another, and all of the subcommittees are extremely open.
Chris?
I take your point about national security, and certainly there are situations where the membership probably does need to be sort of kept off the record, but certainly in the current climate where we've got a national health emergency, do you not think it would be quite conducive to the free flow of information and actually boosting the confidence in the advice that's coming out if people actually knew where it was coming from and who was involved in making those decisions?
Yes, I've given you a rather long version of the word yes, so I'll now give a short version. Yes.
Thank you.
But there are, we have to take advice when we're given it by, serious bodies like CPNI. But my view is yes.
Thank you.
And so to be clear, as Sir Patrick.
Thank you. Is there a consideration of some of the economic impacts on measures being taken as part of SAGE?
Is that addressed to me?
Yes.
If you mean, does SAGE have a specific economic group? No, it doesn't. Do some of the things that have been done have economic consequences? Absolutely, yes, they do. And I think that there is a very legitimate question as to in what format, and this is one that Patrick might have a view on as well. In what format is it best to bring together the science, broadest sense, which includes medical sciences, epidemiology, so the behavioural sciences, and so on, and the economics? Is it through the SAGE mechanism, or is it you bring them together in a different mechanism? And this is a very real example where that is being tested. And I can, if it'd be useful, I can lay out what I think are the strengths and weaknesses of either side. But it's not a clear cut. It definitely should go one way or the other. Would it be useful for me to lay that out?
Well, is there, for example, an economist or several economists on SAGE at the moment?
No, there aren't, because that's not part of the advice we're giving. So the advice on economics is absolutely going to government, but it's not going from SAGE. SAGE is providing certain bits of the evidence, but specifically, I'll roll back on that. No, there is one economist from the bank, from the Treasury, who's an excellent economist, but that's the SAGE advice is not economic advice. So although she can actually feed in important insights, including important insights going back to an earlier point, because she comes from a different disciplinary and intellectual background, that's very useful. SAGE is not giving economic advice at the moment, and it's not constituted to give economic advice. If you were to try and turn it into a body which did give economic advice, it would need to have different membership for that bit of advice, because current membership of SAGE would not be, I would not feel comfortable, and they would not feel comfortable giving economic advice. It's not its current makeup.
So currently SAGE is an advisory group on the medical and epidemiological aspects of the crisis.
Well, it's covering everything from immunology through behavioural sciences, through epidemiology and modelling, through clinical and public health. There's a very, very large range of things it's doing, but the bit it's not currently doing is the economic bit, and that's explicit. That's not, it's not that people don't think that's important. They do, but if it's to be done, it has to be done really well. It would need a very different subgroup or membership through that. And the question is really, does that expand it out to be such a large group that it's almost impossible to do what it's already doing, which is already covering quite a wide waterfront?
Well, we'll turn to some of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the measures that have been taken, including the path to lifting some of the restrictions. But I think it's understood by everyone that the economic impact is not confined in itself to in isolation. It has an impact on public health. It has an impact on people's experience across the country of this. So are there steps being taken, given this is the phase of the pandemic in which we could at least anticipate needing to make those decisions? Is there work underway to convene a body that will be capable of giving advice drawing on the strengths of UK experts in these disciplines?
So let's can I kind of divide that into two questions. The first one is there is, and one of the things that I've tried to say several times in public, and I will say again here, is that in terms of looking at just at the public health, there are four forms of major negative impact on health, just narrowly health, that this epidemic is going to have. There's direct deaths from people dying of COVID with the NHS working well. There are indirect deaths because the NHS got overwhelmed, which it has not, due to the fantastic work of the whole of the UK public, as well as the absolute remarkable work of the NHS, but it has not. But that was a second risk of overwhelming emergency services. The third one is the indirect deaths caused by downscaling other health issues and public health issues, elective surgery, where health problems, we might want to come back to this, have probably going to come back, where people have delayed things or stuff hasn't been picked up or dealt with earlier than it otherwise will now be. and this is an indirect effect. The final one, though, and this is absolutely within the scope of SAGE, and we've looked at this, is we all know that there is a gradient between health and deprivation. And if, as a result of economic downturns for prolonged periods, deprivation increases, that will have a health effect. That bit, specifically, SAGE has looked at explicitly, because that is a really key part of the health metric. But there is also advice coming into ministers, into Cabinet Office, into Number 10 and others, which actually is very much on the economic side. It's constituted through a different mechanism, and you could argue about whether the SAGE mechanism should be replicated on the economic side. I don't feel I'm really the right person to ask that. I'm not an economist. But there is, it is entirely legitimate question. But that advice, and I've seen some of that advice, not all of it, but quite a lot of it, don't feel competent really to do more than read it and understand it. That advice is very much has to be integrated with the science, medical, and all of these other things which come through SAGE.
I'm grateful, and the committee wants to be helpful in learning the lessons and anticipating some of the next demands. And given the connections with the economy, we think that's important. My colleagues on the committee are, as indeed I think the public in general, are strongly supportive of steps being taken informed by the best scientific advice possible. But I think in many respects it would be, I think, helpful for confidence to be able to see, for example, the papers on which scientific advice is given, to know who the members of SAGE are, subject to any security concerns for any individuals, and to refer to the Scottish example, to be able to see the minutes published, so that we can know whether, when the government maintains that it's following scientific advice, that actually it accords with the advice that's been given. And so I do think that the confidence that the public has in science will not be damaged by transparency, but actually in keeping with the tradition of science of robust scrutiny and openness to see whether tests and models can be replicated. I think that's in keeping with our best traditions. But let me,
I agree.
I'm grateful. Well, we'll perhaps reflect on how that can apply in the next stage. Let me go to my colleague Graham String.
Point you've made, Chair. Can I ask Professor Whitty, is there not a point about transparency that quite legitimately members of SAGE will have outside interests? They will be consultants for different pharmaceutical companies, have other business interests. Should we not have a right to know that? That might affect their advice. That is standard procedure when these people come before select committees or when they write academic papers.
Well, firstly, within the SAGE process itself, certainly we would take account of conflicts of interest. In a sense, this is a variant of, an important variant of, the question the chair has just asked, which is the chair has asked for, and we in principle agree, that there should be openness in this. There really is, in this particular setting, this isn't a national security emergency, there is not really a strong counter-argument from a scientific point of view, but we absolutely have to take the advice of, we SAGE, and SAGE of course sits on top of multiple other committees, which feed in, and then the much wider academic effort that's behind this. But the SAGE mechanism in this setting, there's no particular reason, in my view, for secrecy per se. I do accept that that does potentially lead to the risk of lobbying and all those sorts of things, but openness in general should be the starting position, and there has to be a strong argument against it. In a sense, I'm agreeing.
Great.
Thank you. When the policy moved from mitigation to suppression, this committee was given a number of quite frightening figures about the number of people who might die from COVID-19. But were similar figures produced for the collateral damage that might be caused? I mean, you've just been through the 4 ways that people can die through this, or the causes of death through this crisis. Were equivalent figures looked at when that change of policy happened?
Well, firstly, to clarify, because I think this is something which gets reported repeatedly and repeatedly inaccurately in media reports. What we're trying to do at the moment is in a sense, the 3rd stage of what we were trying to do, you know, contain if it was containable initially, then delay, and then at a certain point, mitigate. Mitigate meaning stopping the NHS being overwhelmed. And that is what a lot of what we're trying to do at the moment is. People can call it suppression or mitigation. It's the same thing. It's stopping the NHS being overwhelmed. And that is the policy we have, and that is the policy we were always likely to have, because that is absolutely critical for reasons that are obvious to absolutely all your viewers. But, and this goes to the heart of you know, many of the difficulties of decisions about, for example, timing, was if you view the question and of when you should start to do these, viewing reducing COVID peak absolutely in isolation. It's just assume it does absolutely no harm. It's simply, that's all you got to do. Then you end up with a slightly different answer to if you say, let's balance multiple different things in health across different areas. Now, what we didn't have was a very precise, we now have a much better understanding of what the potentials for this were. But our view was, for a short period, the impact of these secondary effects were likely to be significantly smaller, broadly, but this was relatively qualitative, it wasn't quantitative, than if we had not brought in measures which were necessary to get the force of transmission, below 1. And clearly, what we needed to do was get the force of transmission below 1, or the NHS would have been overwhelmed. Now, I think in going to the next stage, the question you asked, which is now let's try and put some figures on how the different things play out, are going to be quite important. And some initial analysis has been done. It hasn't been fully completed, but we absolutely are looking at that question.
Thank you. Brian?
The question I actually asked was whether those figures were looked at the beginning of the process. We now have some of the figures for what's happening in the NHS and more generally. We know, fortunately, and obviously everybody welcomes it, that the intensive care units haven't been overwhelmed, but the rest of the NHS has been underwhelmed in a sense. There are 42% of NH beds that are empty at the present time. I had a meeting of Greater Manchester MPs this morning with the Mayor, and the number of referrals to consultants of people with suspected cancer has reduced by 2/3. One can go through all sorts of medical statistics like that. And what I'd really like to know is whether that was looked at the beginning in a statistical way, the way you approach the main problem of COVID-19, and whether you're looking at it in detail now.
So, so in terms of, was it looked at in statistical terms beforehand? No, because we didn't have data we thought we could do that with, but we absolutely took the general point into account. I think there are 2 bits of it, one of which was measurable beforehand, which is deliberately reducing the elective care. But the other side, which has really been really clear in terms of people's behaviours, but I do not think was predictable beforehand. It was predictable in general it would happen. It wasn't predictable in any quantitative way, were people's responses on the emergency side. And we are very worried about this. And I have made this point in press conferences for that reason, to say to the people, look, what everybody have done, what the NHS have done, is to keep the emergency service running always with capacity throughout this whole thing. That has been the critical thing, one of the critical things that's been achieved, as well as pulling down the total number of COVID deaths. And yet, when you look at this, and this is really, we now do have data, what you see is that things like emergency admissions, in certainly England and Scotland, I don't have data at the moment elsewhere, gone down from just over 18,000 to just a bit over 10,000, so 41% reduction. A&E attendance has gone down, and things which are more around not emergency but very urgent things like 2-week cancer waits have also gone down. This is one of the things that we need to be clear about, which is that we do have capacity for emergencies now. We have had it all the way through this. That's the achievement of the NHS and the whole population. But we also need to think now seriously about how to minimise the amount of time by which we got this urgent but not emergency stuff, and make sure that it's moving back up to the appropriate levels. And NHS England are working a lot on this. And we now have real data rather than guess data, and that clearly makes it much easier to try and work out exactly what it is we're aiming for.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Jeremy Hunt, but just to pick up on something you said, Professor Whitty. You talked about the force of transmission, the R number. And in the press conference a couple of days ago, you said that we can't allow R, the force of transmission, to go above 1 for any extended period at any point. And this is to determine what we do in terms of the social distancing measures. How do you measure R?
So just for those who, I know, Chair, you know this, but I'm just for those who are not so used to this. So R is a very simple concept, which is if R is 1, on average, one person is giving this disease, or indeed any other disease, to one person stable in the population. If R is 2, then one person gives it to 2 people, give it to 4 people, give it to 8. It's exponentially growing, or if it's anything above 1. And if it's below 1, which it is now due to the work that the whole population has done, then it is falling away. But left to its own devices, if we did nothing, the R would naturally go back above 1 again.
But how do you measure it?
So that's the first, just so people understand what it is. In terms of its measurement at the moment, we're measuring it relatively indirectly through hospital admissions, ICU admissions, and much more delayed, but sadly through people dying of this disease. What we're moving over to, actually as of this weekend, it's beginning to be ramped up, is a process which the ONS is doing, where they're going to be sampling a random sample of the population across the UK, sending out, obviously these people who volunteer, but sending out swabs, and people are going to send back their swabs, and we're going to do this repeatedly so that we can actually get not just when the slightly delayed situation when people reach hospital, but much earlier when people first exhibit symptoms, or indeed they have the virus without any symptoms at all. So the aim of this is so that we have a much more accurate and direct, and importantly earlier, measure of R, so that if it starts creeping up towards or above 1, we know about it early and we can then take action.
I mean, this will be crucial if it's one of the tests that governs whether restrictions can be lifted. So when will that new means of estimating without the time lag that hospital admissions involve, when will that be available? Will it be there in time to inform the decision in a few weeks' time?
Yeah, so I as I said, ONS is contacting people, I think today, from my knowledge. People will have things sent out to them over the weekend, as I'm told, start to get results for the first cut this week. That doesn't give you an R, but that gives you a this is where we are now. And then it's the repeated nature of looking at this over time. You can start to see, are the numbers expanding? Are they contracting, or are they staying the same? And in broad terms, it is expanding, R's above 1. If they're contracting, it's below 1. And if they're staying the same, it's 1.
So when do you expect to publish the newly derived R figure which the...
Well, we won't get data, as I said, for this on this week, but the process has started. I mean, we can still derive R now, but it is looking further back in time. And this direct measurement is a better measure of how to do it. Once we've actually started to get the repeats, so that as of next week, data will be coming in. Exactly when ONS and the public health people who are working with them feel that the data is secure enough to publish, I don't have a date for, and I don't want, again, to put a date in the public domain that's wrong, but I do expect it to be relatively soon, certainly within the next couple of weeks. This will be up and running. Quite when the data will be secure enough to give a number, I don't want to commit to.
Excellent. Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Chair. Some questions for Professor Whitty, and I'd just like to start by thanking you for your brilliant work in this crisis. And I was lucky enough to benefit from those insights when I was Health Secretary. You said earlier in the session that you've been pushing for an expansion in our testing capacity. And you also said that we can learn from Germany, which got ahead on testing early. I just wonder if you think that might be one of the reasons why their death rates are so much lower than us, France, Spain, and Italy.
So my view is being able to test gives you multiple things you can do which you can't do otherwise, and there is absolutely no doubt that operationally Germany moved ahead of the UK and indeed most other countries, not necessarily all. I think that drawing a straight line between testing more and better outcomes is a lot harder, and I think that people make a rather simplistic kind of, if you can test more, you get fewer things. Testing is simply a tool to allow you to do other things. It's the things you can do with the testing that help you. And if you do a large amount of undirected testing, it really won't help particularly at all. I think that Germany has done a great job in terms of the way it's controlled this. I have to say, when it started off doing well, when I spoke to my German counterparts, and I spend my time, right, as I should, talking to counterparts around the world, finding their experience. And for example, this morning I was talking to my counterparts in Italy. When I said to them, why do you think you're doing well? Their short answer was, I don't know. I suspect that testing is one of the components of that, because it allowed them to do things which others have not been able to do. So I fully accept that having the ability to test allows for a better response. Absolutely, that's the reason for having it. But I think to just draw a straight line that says, well, testing equals better outcomes, that I think would not be correct.
Jeremy?
Thank you. And just another couple of quick ones. On the 5th of March, Professor Whitty, you told the Health Select Committee that it was important not to lock down too early. And I just wondered, did you continue to advise that we should not be locking down right up until the 24th of March, when we did do our national lockdown?
Well, I think that, well, firstly, the answer is no. Secondly, what we did, and I think it's, people kind of have, again, there's a pre-lockdown state and there's just lockdown. Actually, multiple things happened in stages all the way through that month, as SAGE advised that different things are brought in, starting with the ones that have got big impacts but almost no negative downsides. People may laugh at things like washing hands. Actually, they work a lot more effectively than many of the rather more draconian measures that people think of. But the first of those was individual isolation, followed by household isolation and shielding, then into strong recommendations about people working from home, and then on to closing schools, pubs, and clubs, and so on, and then on to final lockdown. So it wasn't a kind of, there were various points along the way, each one of which was advised by SAGE that was the thing to do. And the difficult question with this was, firstly, what is the right combination to do? And the second was, what is the exact timing by which this should happen? And I note in the last week that I and my colleagues have been berated by one set of professors in one newspaper for going too late, and another professor in another newspaper for doing too much too early. In reality, we will in due course have to go back and look over this and say exactly what's the best way to do this. And we're going to have to do sort of post-action review and say exactly how do we do this. But what we did was we did this phased, staged approach all the way through basically March, from quite early on in March through to the final lockdown on 23rd.
Thank you.
So I suppose my last question on this, Chair, if I may, is just the thing that I think is difficult to understand is that at that point on the 24th of March, the analysis showed that the number of people with the disease was doubling every 5 days. So if you had done that 2 weeks earlier, you would potentially have more than halved the number of people who got the disease. And I just wondered what the rationale was for not going a bit earlier with the heavier measures, given what we saw came later.
Well, I think this is one of those ones where, I can give an incredibly long answer that will take the rest of this session, going through the discussions that were in SAGE. I think this is an area where it is unbelievably easy to be facile, if I'm honest. I'm not saying you're doing this, but I'm just saying some of the commentary in the press, you think, actually, have you thought this through? And to go back, for example, to a previous question about have you thought through the downsides of a lockdown too early, just in narrow health terms, leaving aside anything else, getting this right between going too early and going too late was a very difficult judgment call. this thing moved actually very fast. You talked about a doubling time of five days. Actually, by the time that it was moving quickly in the UK, it was in fact shorter than that. So it moved really quite quickly. There was a point, the path that was followed was one that we were predicting. The speed of upswing was a bit faster than I would have predicted if I'd been asked on the 5th of March. Not by a huge amount, but by enough to be appreciable. And I think that, that's, I think, clear from SAGE. I think even SAGE data is already out there. It will be from other ones. But the difference was one of relatively small degree on this in that window of time between early March and late March.
Thank you.
And this will be gone over multiple times. But I think that the end of the epidemic is really the time, frankly, to do this properly in a technical way and in a non-partisan way.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Darren Jones and then Catherine Fletcher and Zara Sultani. Darren.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. My first question is a short one to Professor Whitty about the lifting of restrictions on a regional level as opposed to a national level. So I'm a Bristol MP and we've been blessed with a lower infection and death rate compared to other parts of the country. But what are the SAGE considerations around different approaches to lifting restrictions in different parts of the country?
I mean, it's clearly a critical question, and it's also, and my other CMO colleagues, I'm sure, want to comment from their with the other 3 nations' perspective. In terms of the UK as a whole, the thing to remember, it is fantastic that the South West has had a less severe experience, it's still a bad experience, of this epidemic to date, than other parts of the country. And your point is an absolutely correct one in terms of the epidemiology. The thing, though, to understand with this epidemic is, firstly, that the peak that we're going through at the moment is an artificial peak, almost the same everywhere, as a result of what people did in terms of starting with all those various measures I was talking about with Mr. Hunt in the last interchange, starting with things like self-isolation. And because those happened across the country at roughly the same time, almost exactly the same time, that peak is occurring at broadly the same time around the country. Not exactly the same, but the difference is relatively small. But, and this is the important but, to go from where we are now to an R of above 1, even if it's not a lot above 1, but where you've got exponential growth again, that is possible everywhere in the country. And we're confident that the great majority of the population have not had COVID in your area and in every other area of the UK. And therefore, the ability for this to take off again in a really serious second wave, if we're not careful, is absolutely identical. And so I think if you put those two together, the argument for strong regional variation in what we do is not a terribly convincing one. Whether there are arguments for mild regional variation is something which in a sense I think is probably not for quite now, but there isn't a situation where you can actually say with confidence, as for example, you could have said in bits of China initially after the Wuhan outbreak, or bits of Italy, this is actually different epidemics in different parts of the country. Our epidemic was a much more similar one across the country. So I think the arguments for a regional approach are less strong.
Thank you for that. And was there anyone from any of the CMOs from the regions or nations want to take a different view on that, or is that a shared view?
Everyone share Professor Whitty's view on that. I think I see nods. So I think that's an assent.
Thank you. Professor Whitty, as we move then into the next kind of peak, when we start to lift restrictions at some point in the future, presumably the availability of antibody testing and surveillance testing, and then also the ability to contact trace, whether that's via mobile app or via human endeavors, is going to be extremely important. Could you give us an update on where we currently are in terms of effective antibody testing, and also your views on the effectiveness of mobile applications for tracing, either in its own right or in partnership with human tracing?
Right, so on the first one, so serology testing is the antibody testing where you can tell someone has had the infection. Again, I know you know this, but I'm saying this for any viewers who are not aware of this, as opposed to the other test, which is for people, which we were talking about earlier, for people who have got it at the moment. First thing to say is the antibody tests that were initially available were only moderate. There are better ones available now, but there are none that I would say are absolutely terrific in terms of antibody testing. Because what you want is something which can say with real high degree of accuracy, if it's positive, you have definitely had this, and if it is negative, you have definitely not. That's the sensitivity and the specificity of a test. And very often with early tests, and we're still with early tests, there's a trade-off. So if you have a high sensitivity, you have a lower specificity, and vice versa. So the tests at the moment are not perfect. They will undoubtedly get better, but they are good enough for us to be able to get a feel for how many people, what proportion of the population have actually had the infection, with a bit of aiming off. They're not, in my view, yet good enough to be able to say at an individual level, you've definitely had it and you've definitely not. So first thing is there's a certain amount of uncertainty around the test. Now, there are now serology surveys going on in the UK, also internationally. Both are important because obviously we learn from other countries. The first data are beginning to come back from those at the moment, but we're not yet at a point where I feel confident that I can say, give or take, this is the proportion of the population in the UK that have had it. Now, there's a big but to this. This is one of the key things we need to know in terms of looking back over time, because if it was a situation where, let us say, 2/3 of the British population had it, firstly, that would mean that the overall mortality rate from the infection was considerably lower than we currently think it is. And secondly, this might have implications for immunity across the population. But my view at the moment, and I would love to be proved wrong, is that it is unlikely that any part of the UK, maybe outside London, will have a seroprevalence much above 10%. And I would expect, for example, the southwest for it to be lower for the reasons you earlier gave than, for example, London. So I think it's quite a small proportion of the population, but the only way of knowing that for sure is to look, and it would be absolutely critical to look, and I would be delighted if it was higher than that. That would be very good news.
And just briefly on the specificity question on the test there, Professor Whitty, what is the accuracy of the current test that we have available, and what's the gap between that and the accuracy that you would like to have?
So at the moment, what we have is generally tests, and there are a lot of tests now, and a lot of them being developed in the academic sector, and there are a number of dipsticks and a variety of things. So, but I'm generalizing a bit. But in general, we've got quite a lot of tests that have got pretty good specificity. They don't pick up false positives, but they miss quite a lot of true positives based against people we know had it because they've been swabbed and over several weeks later, the test doesn't go positive. Most of them, I would say, are not much more than 80%. Quite a lot of them are a lot less than 80%. And the danger is, as people push up the sensitivity, the specificity may go down, so you start getting a lot of false positives. So this will improve. There's no doubt this will improve, but we're not yet at the point I can give I would feel confident basing my decisions as an individual on the tests we got. I do think they're probably now good enough to say broadly this is the percentage in the population. On your other question about the app, I'm not an app expert. I do understand contact tracing, however, it would be contact tracing done conventionally is a very powerful tool of public health, most useful when you've got relatively small numbers, but it is unbelievably labor intensive to do it if you're doing it kind of the old-fashioned way with people contacting other people and ringing around and all those sorts of things. And so if we can get an app which can take a lot of the heavy lifting and actually do the contact tracing by means of proximity and variety of other things, that would obviously widen out our ability to do contact tracing. And that's clearly what some of our colleagues are trying to develop. But app development is a skill that's beyond my skill set.
Well, the committee will be taking evidence next week on precisely that subject with representatives from NHSX and other experts. Let me go to Catherine Fletcher, then Zara Sultana, then Erin Bell, and then Simon Hall.
Hi, Professor Whitty. Nice to see you back. Hope you're feeling better. We've spoken very briefly in the past about data and the importance of different trends coming out in the data in this novel disease. So I think Zara probably is going to touch on a similar point. There's some really concerning reports in the press about BAME communities perhaps being differentially affected. Is there any data sets, either subnationally, nationally, or even globally, that are allowing us to look into people with different inherited immunotypes and maybe understand if they need different advice?
Thank you. This is a really important question, both for the general population, and I have to say I feel this very strongly as a jobbing NHS person, among healthcare workers, where there's been a clear signal that a very high proportion of those who've sadly died have been BME colleagues. There's pretty clear evidence that there is an overrepresentation, at least in certain areas, of people from BME backgrounds in terms of the number of people who get into severe difficulties with this disease. What's not clear is the reason for that. Is that actually because of directly ethnic issues in terms of genetic issues, because they've got African or South Asian genetic heritage, for example, or is this, for example, because they might have comorbidities, or are there socioeconomic or other factors that explain it? So the fact of it, I think there's no doubt there is something we need to look at really seriously and as fast as we can. But what we really need is the causes of it, because if we understand the causes of it, then we actually can do something to improve the situation. And there are ITU data, which we've looked at to get a first cut of this. I've asked Public Health England to look at this really seriously because this is a major concern, looking at any data sets. And we have in the National Institute of Health Research put out a call for our academic colleagues also to look at this, because people can look in different ways and in a sense triangulate and try and work out, as I say, not whether there's a problem, but actually the key question is why, and is it because of the ethnicity, or is it because of something else that we need also we need to be addressing, because this is something we must get better at.
Catherine.
Yeah, so just a confirmation that the data's coming in a number of different streams, including immunotypes, but also index of deprivation or levels of exposure depending on job type. And and SAGE would be part of looking at those 3 different data sets to see if there's a signal there.
Yes, and in the first instance, I think the data needs to be brought together by academic and public health colleagues. SAGE is very interested in the output of that, but I mean, SAGE is a kind of final path through to innocence. So I think, first of all, we need to get the data right and get lots of people who are good at looking at data in different ways, including, as you say, genetic and other areas, and make sure we get the data as tight as we can here. We will see a different pattern in the UK, inevitably, than other nations, because our ethnic mix is different. Which is obviously a very good thing. And to go back to, one of the great, great things about the NHS is it is one of the most multi-ethnic employers in the world. But we do worry about the fact that colleagues from BME backgrounds are overrepresented, sadly, in people who've died from this terrible disease.
Thank you.
May I just say one thing? You gave us a briefing back months and months ago, and broadly, architecturally, that strategy is still holding true now. And I know it must have taken a lot of hard work to get from that point to this. So my thanks.
Thank you, Catherine, and I'm sure the whole committee joins in that view. Let me turn to Zara and then to Erin Bell. Zara Sultan.
Thank you, Chair. Just to follow up on Catherine's line of questioning, the government has said that ethnicity won't be recorded on death certificates. I'd like to ask Professor Whitty whether this will change in order for us to have the data that we need to see if there are trends and what the causes are regarding BAME communities being disproportionately affected by COVID-19.
Thank you. Professor Whitty.
Death certification, so this question about what should be recorded on death certificates is a long-standing one, and obviously it's unlikely we'll change it just for this particular reason. But actually, the point you make, which is should we be recording ethnicity much more systematically, and I have to say the other one that we should be recording much more systematically is gender, across a whole range of things, so that when these kind of questions arise, we can address them much better. Basically, I'm broadly in agreement with you that we need to have much better data on this on multiple sources. I don't want to make promises on death certificates because it's not in my line of responsibility.
Can I just ask some of the representatives of the other nations whether that is the same practice in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, that ethnicity is not recorded? I think Professor Atherton, yeah.
Yeah, it's the same process certainly in Wales, and I would endorse what Professor Whitty has said, that getting more information would be useful in general terms, and maybe it's something that needs to be looked at in the broader context.
So you share his view. I mean, given that some of you are members of the scientific advisory group to government, I mean, it seems to me that the data has been so central to the handling of this pandemic that not to have information on ethnicity and indeed gender seems to be a pretty basic gap in the data that, given that we're scaling up lots of other things at pace, is that not something that could be done very quickly? So we are capturing data on behalf of people who very sadly are losing their lives in this pandemic.
If your thesis is that it should be looked at, I would absolutely agree. And you know, more data is absolutely needed. This is a science. You know, we are trying to use science to drive our response to this unprecedented epidemic. And the more data we have, the better. So.
That's very helpful. I'll go back to Zara.
Thank you, Chair. To Professor Whitty again. On April the 22nd, you said that until a vaccine could be developed, we're going to have to rely on other socially disruptive measures for quite a long period of time. However, you've also previously said that societally, long periods of social isolation are not a good thing. And at the same time, the government's chief scientific advisor has said that the development of a vaccine is not certain. What does this mean for the long-term management of the pandemic if a vaccine is not found?
Thank you. I mean, this is a really central question, and I think, to be clear, there's a vaccine and then the alternative route by which health science would naturally get out of an infectious disease issue is treatment. And there are some diseases, and HIV is the most obvious one, where we do not have a vaccine, but we do have highly effective treatment. So obviously we're trying to go down both paths. But on vaccine specifically, until we do have either a vaccine or a drug, we are going to have to rely on social measures. And as we all know, these are really problematic, and everybody's seeing that at the moment. In terms of a vaccine probability, the first question we do not actually know is, do you get natural immunity to this disease for a prolonged period of time? Now, if we don't, that doesn't make a vaccine impossible, but it makes it much less likely. And we simply don't know that yet. There's a little bit of evidence of some people may have been reinfected with this, having had a previous infection. That's a slightly concerning situation. And certainly some other coronaviruses, immunity wanes relatively quickly. So we need to be careful that we don't assume that we'll have a vaccine for this disease as we have for, let's say, measles, which once you have it, you're protected for life. We may or we may not, but we need to be absolutely clear about that. It is, however, possible to use a vaccine in a number of different ways, and I'm just going to highlight two of them because either of them could give us a route out of this. The first one, which is the one everyone imagines when they hear about it, is a vaccine that stops you getting infected, which you give to the whole population. You can actually get population immunity. This is the only situation I would use, incidentally, the term herd immunity in a useful way as a policy aim, because you vaccinate people and therefore people are protected and everyone around them is protected. That's the only situation I would use. The second way is you can have vaccines which are not capable of providing that level of immunity, but they provide enough protection, people don't get severe disease. So we might get a vaccine that's rather less effective, but is sufficient that if we vaccinated everybody who's at high risk of dying of this, who's at high risk of catching it, like healthcare workers, but above all, people who are at high risk of dying from it, the elderly in particular, and people with coexisting health conditions, we might well be able to massively reduce the mortality, even if there was still natural infection. So either of those paths we need to follow, and there's an enormous international effort where the UK is very much one of the leaders, and as I think you'll have read from the newspapers this morning, first vaccine into humans today in an Oxford group, but there are many other groups around the world looking at this to try and get a vaccine, but we cannot guarantee success. Vaccines are looked for every infectious diseases, they're not found for all of them.
Thank you. Sarah?
Thank you. And one final question to Professor Whitty. A month ago in this committee's evidence session on science advice to the government, I asked Professor Sharon Peacock of Public Health England on exercise Cygnus, a recent pandemic preparedness exercise. I'd like to learn from you what lessons were learned from this or more recent preparedness exercises that we might not be aware of, and how has it benefited our COVID response? Did it predict a shortage of PPE and ventilators, and will results of the exercise be published?
Well, on the results of the exercise being published, I don't know because I'm not involved in that side of it. But I was involved in the exercise, and I have absolutely read the report to learn from it. I think it might be worth asking the same question of Michael McBride from Northern Ireland, because he was actually a CMO there then, which I was not at that stage. So he was very intimately involved. The short version is that the majority of the things that were learned from that, a lot of things were learned from that exercise, but the majority of them are actually to do with how the coordination of the response happened. One of its major recommendations, incidentally, was that the four UK CMOs had to work very closely together, which, as you heard earlier, is happening. A lot about a kind of command and control system if we got to a major pandemic. A lot about legislation. So there was a very strong push that there needed to be a kind of draft bill so that it could get through Parliament. And I think, as you'll all be aware, being parliamentarians, there was a COVID bill which was built very, very heavily from the bill that was designed and heavily modified following this, as I understand it. So a lot of those were those kinds of operational command, control, and above all, coordination mechanisms. I haven't seen bits that were specifically about kit. There may have been bits that were not part of what I was doing, because it was a very large exercise that went on over 2 days in multiple different areas. But it wasn't the kit bit that I was involved in. It was the how do you actually make sure there's proper coordination across the system. Michael may know more about this because he was, as I say, a CMO during this period.
Let's just turn to Dr. McBride very briefly on that, then I'll come to Aaron Bell.
Yes, I mean, as Chris has highlighted, the learning really was around coordination. It was primarily also around legislation, and the aim for easements in legislative requirements, statutory requirements, and we were very quickly to turn on the coronavirus bill on the foot of that, and also the issues around workforce shortages, and the ability we had on this occasion to rapidly bring back those staff right across health and social care who were retired. There were no specific issues to my memory or recollection in relation to PPE, but it also again emphasised the importance of surge planning, which again you saw our ability to turn that on in relation to our response to COVID-19. And again, much of that learning has been taken forward and has been integrated into our response to this pandemic.
Thank you very much indeed. So let me turn to my colleague Aaron Bell and then Simon Hall.
Thank you, Chair. With your indulgence, a couple of questions to Professor Whitty on the initial response and then one on face masks. Professor Whitty, thank you for all you're doing. It was the 2nd of March that SAGE concluded that sustained transmission was already happening in the UK. Are you able to put a date on the time at which you first advised the UK government that it was highly likely that we would have the epidemic we have had in the UK?
Short answer is no, just because to do that, I'd need to go through all my notes along this kind of way. And as I say, I think there will be an important time to go back over everything and try and do that, but to be able to give you a really accurate answer. But I'll give you a broad answer in terms of how my thinking evolved over that time, very much informed by SAGE and very much informed by the wider community. I mean, I think you've got to go back to, the very first point at which anybody outside China knew about this is 31st of December last year, when they notified the WHO. I had my first discussion with my deputy, Jonathan Van Tam, about this 2nd of January. We both agree that this was something to watch, but there are quite a lot. If there's something called, if you're interested in this area, there's something called ProMed, where you can look at emerging epidemics and potential infections that happen around the world. This was a serious one to look at, but it wasn't one that we were confident would go forward at that point. I put forward 3 tests on the 5th of January, which were, these are the things that should make us worry that this could go further. One of which is, do healthcare workers start being affected? Because that usually is the first thing you start to get with severe person-to-person transmission. Is there person-to-person transmission, particularly within family groups? And is there wide geographical spread? And my view was, if any of those were met, then we should worry. And people know the history of that, and things moved on from there. There was then a period when it was not really clear to anybody, and a lot of people can claim to be wise after the event, but it was not clear to anybody whether this was going to go down the route similar to what happened with SAGE, another coronavirus, a very different coronavirus, but obviously, SARS, another coronavirus, where, as you know, it was eventually actually controlled at a point when less than 1,000 people had died, but it did get outside China originally, spread in the near abroad, and then spread to Canada, a little bit wider spread than that, but then was contained and has not been seen since. Was it going to emerge a bit like MERS, which again had some outbreaks outside its home territory, or was it going to behave epidemiologically, not clinically, a bit more like a pandemic respiratory thing, of which the most well-known is influenza? And it really wasn't clear at that early stage. So we had to start planning for both eventualities, a containment strategy and a if this goes big strategy. And broadly what happened is over the first several weeks, my view about, and our view collectively about, is this a containable disease, or is this something which is simply going to spread around the world? And if it spreads around the world, it's going to come to the UK, whether we like, whatever we do, move steadily further and further. But it wasn't a one day it was all, we can contain this, and the next day it was all, this is gone. It was a basically steady slope down, and I kept people informed. And as you know, the government really was in full action on this in many different aspects, including, I have to say, briefing members of Parliament by the end of January. So within 3 weeks of all of this starting, and it moved then by degrees. So that's a broad answer. When we get to the point when I can go through absolutely everything and spend my time doing that, which I want to do because it's important to do, I can go through in microscopic detail exactly how we went through the various stages.
Thank you, Professor Whitty. So following on from that, and also from the questioning from Graham String and Jeremy Hunt earlier, I think you're right. There has been far too much hindsight applied to your judgments at the time by a lot of people, and we recognise the uncertainty. The contemporaneous evidence we took seemed to suggest that one of the real risks of going too early with the lockdown was that it would break down on the other end of that lockdown. And you have said yourself that you've been pleasantly surprised, I guess, by quite how effective the lockdown has been and how well people have responded to the lockdown. So with that hindsight yourself, would you potentially have gone earlier with heavier measures?
I honestly think that the right time for me to try and go through this, and the difference would be a matter, in my view, of a relatively small number of days.
Yes.
And remember that there wasn't, I think people think about this, nothing happened till the 23rd. Not true.
No,
a lot of things happened well in advance of the 23rd. It wasn't a nothing happened till the 23rd. And that, I think that it's a surprising false memory people have. But the reasons for doing it is not just that. Those concerns that not going too early, concerns that people might not be able to maintain it. The negative health effects of this, which Mr. Stringer mentioned earlier on, were obvious. We didn't, as he points out, have an exact quantification, but it was obvious that there were downsides to lockdowns of a significant sort. And we haven't talked about mental health, but loneliness and all those sorts of issues as well. So the idea that this was a cost-free intervention is clearly false, purely in health terms, leaving aside societal, economic and other terms. So it was important in all of our views, and I don't think anybody really would dispute this, that you both don't go too late and you don't go too early. And the difference between exactly what is the right answer on that is quite a narrow difference. Lots of people will debate it, lots of people come to different opinions on it, and I do think it's important we do that because we need to learn from this, and we need to learn from what happened in different countries that, in knowing what they knew then, took different decisions in different ways, and we need to learn from all that. I absolutely agree with that. But I do not, at this point in time, I don't look back and say, well, I'm absolutely confident if I knew what I know now, I'd have done this differently. Yeah. But I do think that analysis has to happen. And I'm not claiming it was exactly the right response. All I'm claiming is I don't think that we should try and rush to judgment until we've actually looked at this really quite seriously, including the downsides. And also, above all, realizing this is only the beginning of this epidemic.
Yes.
So many people make things as if this is now over in every country. Every country in the world has still got a serious future problem to deal with. Let's see how we all come out of it and learn from one another, hopefully learn from one another in a way that minimizes mortality everywhere, all around the world. But this is going to be difficult for a long time. We're absolutely not in the situation where this was just sorted. If we'd just done something different 3 days differently, this would have been different, or even a week differently. This whole thing would be different. I think that's not really a fully supportable proposition.
That's understood.
Trace and trace was not part of the strategy. In fact, it was stood down. Was that because SAGE was advised that the capacity within Public Health England was not available practically to deploy that when it convened at the end of January?
Well, I think, I mean, there are probably multiple reasons. And again, I think what I'm trying to do is avoid making, because I'm trying to answer a very short question in a very short period of time, a rather simplistic answer to what is actually quite an important question. There was certainly, so the first period, the reason we were using case finding and isolation and all the things that go with that was we thought that there was a realistic prospect, it was a diminishing prospect, but it was still a realistic prospect, that this could be contained geographically and this disease would simply go away in the world. There'd be big problems in China, maybe a few other areas. They would be got on top of locally. There'd be spillover, including to the UK. We could pick up those cases. And my view was basically dichotomous. Either this was something which was containable, in which case the UK would contain it, or this is something which is uncontainable, in which case no country can contain it, including the UK. So initially the policy was, let's see if we can contain this. And this was every country in the world took different versions of this, but broadly that's what we were doing. Once this became clearly a global pandemic, recognized formally by the WHO, but I think, you know, clearly heading that way a bit before that, it was clearly going to come in from multiple sources. Actually, a lot of it to the UK came in from Italy, but it could have come from elsewhere. That's just because of the sequence of events. At that point, a combination of where the epidemic was in the UK, where the epidemic was in Europe, and our own capacity meant that trying to do this and deploy all our resources to try to do this with the ratio of people who'd be followed up in this thing, where you couldn't say, right, we're going to start off with where you come from geographically, which was our starting point. We're going to have to do this on syndrome with a very non-specific syndrome. Most people who transmit from this probably have quite small, quite minor symptoms, very different from, let's say, smallpox or even Ebola, where you can actually, it's relatively easy generally to spot the people who are infectious. This is a very different sort of disease, moving at phenomenal speed, doubling every 3 to 4 days at this stage. And my technical view and our technical view collectively was it really wasn't likely to add a huge amount at that particular point, given the resources we had. Now, in a different situation with huge different resources, you know, if you did a mental experiment in which we had infinite testing, infinite numbers of people trained, you know, we might have taken a different view. But in any emergency of any sort, you deal with the tools you've got and the situation you'll find yourselves in. So that really would be my answer. But you know, to give a full answer would take a lot longer. That may seem a long answer to you, but that's actually the very short version.
It's clear, and we'll no doubt come back to it in the future. Aaron had one other question.
Yes, yeah, no, all you've just said is understood, Professor Whitty. Just on face masks then, because you've said this is an epidemic that's going to be going on into the future. We've heard before that the evidence around face masks is relatively weak, but we've also heard that SAGE has been considering it earlier this week on the 21st. What's your latest assessment of the evidence around face masks and whether we might recommend their use by the population at large?
So very atypically, because I never like doing this, this is one I'm going to body swerve, only because this has not yet gone properly to ministers for them to consider. But absolutely the evidence we need to talk about, but we need to do that in the context of how ministers have actually taken a view on this. But the evidence didn't suddenly turn from weak to incredibly strong. But it's a difficult area, and as you'll have seen from different countries in the world, many countries are taking slightly different approaches to this.
Thank you, that's fine.
Does this conform to what you just described about testing that early stage? Is it a combination of the scientific advice on the desirability and the availability?
Well, the only area where availability is something we would want absolutely to take into consideration, and this bit of SAGE advice I'm very happy to reveal because it is pretty obvious, it doesn't need science really, is the area where face masks absolutely do work is used by healthcare workers at a medical grade in a healthcare setting. Every country in the world and the World Health Organization says if using face masks in the general public threatens the ability of healthcare or social care workers to get hold of medical grade face masks, that would be a public health own goal. That is an absolute, everybody agrees that. So to that extent, but I think the debates around the world are, okay, so given that that is true, now what is the best way to approach it? And that's the one which I think, you know, absolutely legitimately people want to have that discussion in public, but I do think it's appropriate that ministers have the advice and consider it before we go further.
Thank you. Simon Hall.
Chairman, and can I thank you again for inviting us to join your committee this afternoon. I think probably these are questions to Dr. McBride, if I may. We talk about 4 nations. Of course, there are 5 nations ready to consider, and I wonder what the challenges have been as a result of having to try and work cooperatively with the UK government and the government of the Irish Republic, and if there have been those challenges, have they been resolved?
I think, just as return to my answer to the earlier question, we have very strong, very effective professional working relationships between myself and my counterpart in the Republic of Ireland, and between the public health bodies in the Republic and Northern Ireland. And I think that my experience of the cooperation at ministerial level between the Taoiseach, the Tánaiste, Minister Harris, and Minister Swan, and First Minister, Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland has been very, very positive. As I say, we had a North-South ministerial meeting back in early March. There have been 2 subsequent ministerial conference calls, including the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland as well. And there's a further meeting and engagement plan for Tuesday of next week, which I will be supporting ministers at as well. So my experience of that has been that this is a very challenging environment for all of us, but that the cooperation north, south, east, west has been exemplary.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've obviously had the debate about the opening of cemeteries, and I know Stormont is discussing that this afternoon. We wait to see what they're going to say. But another issue of some concern has been the reuse of PPE, where Minister Swan has suggested that, well, he hasn't ruled out that the reuse of PPE could be used, whereas the Northern Ireland Royal College of Nursing has come out against it, as I understand it. I just wondered, from a medical perspective, what you associate the risks as being with the reuse of PPE equipment.
Well, I mean, there are very limited circumstances, and where and only where it would, the scientific evidence would support the reuse of PPE. So, for instance, there are guidance globally, and other parts of the world are looking, for instance, at ways of potentially decontaminating and reusing respiratory masks, or FFP2, FFP3 mask, and to do that safely. But I think as what the Minister has indicated is that that would only be in circumstances where that is fully supported by the scientific evidence, and when there's been full and complete engagement with the relevant professional bodies, including patient representative, professional representative groups, trade union colleagues, etc., so that they are also confident where the evidence would support that. So I think we just need to be clear, as in all of this, that it's important, particularly in an issue where we're asking our frontline health professionals to put themselves potentially in harm's way, that they have all the appropriate personal protective equipment that's required, and that conversations in terms of how that's used and any potential reuse of that is actually fundamentally informed by the science, and that's how it should be.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, so perhaps I can just finish off with some quick questions. I think they're directed at Professor Whitty. Professor Neil Ferguson, in evidence to the committee some weeks ago, made an assessment that the number of fatalities that we would experience in the UK was, and I quote, would probably be unlikely to exceed about 20,000 with a lockdown and intense social distancing strategy. Very sadly, it seems that we might reach that level in these days. What is the latest estimate from the model as to the number of fatalities that the UK will experience?
Well, I think my view, so first, 2 things to say on that. First thing is that number does not capture the indirect mortality that is going to happen as a result of this, nor necessarily does it capture all of the mortality that may happen out of hospital. We are measuring, because it is accurate but narrow, hospital mortality, and I think that's pretty accurate data that you see presented, for example, at the daily press conferences. But as I said repeatedly in those, that isn't a full thing, and the data that really matters on this, in my view, and I've again said this repeatedly, is the all-cause, age-adjusted, seasonally adjusted mortality produced by ONS. Because actually, some people people will undoubtedly be missed who have COVID. Some people may well, on death certification, have been ascribed COVID when in fact they don't. But ultimately, what really matters is whether it's direct or indirect. That is the number. And I think the number will be higher than that, even in this first wave of the epidemic. First point. Second thing, though, is we have not finished with this epidemic by a long shot, just getting through this first wave. And we have to, we as a society are going to have a very careful think through how we're going to manage the next phases. But until we've got to the end of it, and basically until we've exited it, either through a vaccine, via drugs, or by some other means, I think I really would be very cautious about putting numbers, because the possibility of further waves, if at some point the R escapes and goes above 1, is always with us. So I really want to be very, very careful about this for all countries. It should be all-cause mortality, age-adjusted, possibly seasonally adjusted, over the course of the epidemic, and we're not there yet.
Normally through these things you expect to become more certain as you experience the path of a pandemic in other countries. But from what you've said, when Professor Ferguson said it was probably unlikely to exceed about 20,000, you can't be, for reasons that you've been very clear about, as explicit about that. Are we finding that the spread of this pandemic is confounding our expectations that we will become more and more certain about how to handle it, and having to rely on figures that become less certain?
Well, I think when I reread the minutes from SAGE from January and early February in preparation for this committee, one of the things that struck me was actually quite a lot of the calls early we got right, with wide uncertainties, but actually the central projection has remained surprisingly stable, although the confidence has come down. There remain some absolutely critical gaps in our knowledge, one of which I think we will get an answer to fairly soon, which is the background seroprevalence, and one of which we will not, which is how long does immunity last. That is an uncertainty. But in very large areas of other areas of science, when the amount of scientific effort around the world that is going into combating this is absolutely extraordinary. And I'm very confident we will know a lot more about this. And were I to give exactly the same, have exactly the same set of questions from you in 3 months, I probably would give you a different set of answers based on the fact we understand more about the virus. So I'm very confident we will understand things better. But the thing about the modelling the first peak is that doesn't tell us what's going to happen in the future, and a lot of that depends on actually what happens with the social distancing measures, and how can we construct a package of those which is sustainable and also keeps the R below 1 and that people adhere to. And if the answer to all of those is yes, then we may well end up in a situation which is closer to what Professor Ferguson was talking about. If the answer to that is no, then we're obviously in a different territory.
Thank you. And finally, on that point, a paper published by Imperial College on the 30th of March concluded that all social distancing measures had to be implemented in order to reach an R of around 1, which is a rather pessimistic reflection. Is it your view that some combination of measures, short of all of them, will be possible to maintain R below 1, or are we looking at a continuation of the regime in which we are at present?
In broad terms, and this is clearly something which ministers in all 4 nations are looking at really seriously at the moment. This is a critical question. The key, the upper and the lower bounds on this, again, I made this point the other day in a press conference, the top bounds is we cannot allow R to go above 1 for any sustained period of time. And the lower bound is we're not going to eradicate this disease, it's with us. This is the future for us, so we need to learn to work to operate alongside it. The R that we have at the moment is somewhere between 0.5 and 1. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it's in the middle of that range, which I think is likely. That does give a little bit of scope for manoeuvre and taking some things off, and while still keeping it below 1. But there are lots of if, buts, and ands to that. But I, on the one hand, do not anticipate, as I hope I've made reasonably clear repeatedly, that we're suddenly going to be able to lift everything. but nor do I think it likely we will have to keep in exactly the current pattern for the indefinite future. There's somewhere between those two, and working out exactly what that is and what the timescale of that is and what the package is going to be a difficult task for governments all around the world, and certainly, obviously, including the UK.
Thank you. So some chinks of light. We're very grateful to you and to your fellow witnesses. We've covered a lot of ground in the last 2 hours. We should perhaps go reflect back on the testimony of very good working relationships between the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, including their chief medical officers. But I know, you said this, your teams and your staff as well. You have reflected that whilst there may be differences between nations, that's not a reflection of differences in interpretation of the science, but operational differences and differences in the incidence of the pandemic in each of the countries. We talked about the importance of transparency and understanding the basis of the evidence on which SAGE is giving advice to ministers. We've talked about, as we reach the next stage of handling of the pandemic, the importance of other disciplines, including economics, to inform the health decisions, as well as some of the other policies that will be required. We've heard that there are steps in place to develop a measure of the crucial R number on which easing some of these lockdown measures depends, and that will be deployed in the next few weeks. We've talked about the importance of tracing, the very crucial questions about understanding the incidence of the pandemic on people of different ethnicities and genders. Talked about the importance of vaccine development and making sure that we have the capacity to manufacture and deploy that when we develop it very quickly. We have learned a little, and probably will learn more in due course, about the lessons from Project Cygnus. The role of face masks, we expect to, following the advice to government, expect an announcement in the days ahead. It was very interesting to hear Professor Whitty's reflections on the initial response taken under conditions of uncertainty, and also to consider the next steps that are also going to be difficult decisions, but it's evident from this hearing are informed by evidence and expertise from professionals right across the United Kingdom. Very grateful for the work that you're doing, and very grateful for you giving evidence to the committee today. I adjourn this meeting of the committee.
Science and Technology Committee, 24th of April.